Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. These are all stories about good versus evil. This style of story is so common that we might naturally assume that this structure is a universal one, but that might not be true. Hero mythology from ancient Greece was usually less concerned with the moral uprightness in its heroes. These stories were usually more concerned with the hero's strengths and general virtues. Most of these virtues were only tangentially ethics related. On top of that, the villains in these ancient Greek stories were rarely out-and-out examples of evil. They were usually just human beings with opposing concerns, or who were villainous to the main character because of circumstance. Achilles was one of the most celebrated heroes in Greek myth, but his heroism never came from the slaying of evil Trojans. The Trojans were never evil to begin with, just the opposite side of the conflict. There was no indication in the Iliad that killing Trojans was making the world a better place, is what I mean. When the Greeks called Achilles a hero, they did so in reference to his martial prowess and his fearlessness. These traits, by the way, were also celebrated in Hector, who fought on the Trojan side. When ancient Greek myths did approach the subject of evil in a way that we modern people are used to, it was with monstrous beings. These beings seemed to exist for destruction and for nothing else. Thematically speaking, these monsters weren't representations of evil, more like representations of the terror inherent in nature. They were exaggerated versions of lions, tigers, bears, and all those other things we have to worry about as human beings. These creatures killed to eat. They turned you to stone because they were cursed to, or they crushed you with a boulder just out of simple and relatable rage. They didn't fight on the side of any larger philosophy. They weren't soldiers for some alternative perspective. They didn't celebrate the bad in life. The people who invented these stories couldn't even imagine a character like that, really. What I think changed this perspective in Western storytelling was the introduction of Christianity. In Christianity, a fundamental clash between good and evil did exist. God represented goodness and Satan represents evil. And the clash between these two forces was just a daily occurrence. We could feel it in our day-to-day lives. Even further back than Christianity though, in pre-Islamic Persia, Zoroastrianism had the same moralistic cosmology. On one hand, you had Ahura Mazda, who like the Judeo-Christian god, represented all good. On the opposite, you have Ahriman, who like Satan, was the king of all evil, basically. Now with this way of thinking in mind, all the bad of the world could be identified as coming from a single source, and everyone who acted on the part of bad could be imagined as people being led under the command of an evil general of sorts. Evil no longer had allies of circumstance, but now genuine, full-time employees working within the human race for it. This is why heroes like Achilles, Perseus, Heracles, Gilgamesh were later to become Saint George and the like. Men who slay dragons, not just as a way to create safety and to prove bravery, but to exterminate a clear and identifiable evil in the world. Another example of this could be somebody like King Arthur, with him and his Knights of the Round Table, at least in some versions of the legend, representing clear Christian virtues like charity and sacrifice. And this is where our modern storytelling comes in. One of the most common plot structures that we're used to in our fiction is the rise of good and its clash with evil. This type of story is so common that it's probably harder to find mainstream, big budget movies which aren't written this way than to find ones which are. Most modern superhero movies use this structure. Those that don't make it a point to feel gritty, even when they're only slightly injecting some gray into an otherwise black and white story. The good, when it's filtered through the language of film, is clear and easy to identify visually or through dialogue. It's usually portrayed being bright-eyed in youth or wise in age, scrappy in experience or still with patience, selfless with goals or underappreciated and eager to prove itself. On the contrary though, evil is represented by cynicism. It strives toward traditional power and is either constructive in its goals to create oppression or destructive towards systems used to create peace or well-being. With just how common these tropes are, one question worth asking is, what is the best example of good versus evil in the world of film? Many answers can be given, many of them good and some of them even great. Just off the top of my head, I can think of maybe Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Spider-Man, Die Hard. These are movies which I think fit this mold perfectly. The film that I'll be examining through this lens though, the one that I think qualifies as the best version of the story structure, is the Coen Brothers classic Fargo. This might seem strange. After all, Fargo is a black comedy. It's a thriller, but only a modest thriller. It has very few story beats, very few twists and turns, and only about 3 or 4 set pieces that come to my mind. On top of that, its characters are satirical representations of Midwestern Americans. They're not knights and warlords or hard-edged NYPD detectives and big-time drug runners. Even compared to more modest stories which contain modest portrayals of good and evil, these characters defy the norm. You might be thinking there are only two characters here who represent clear evil, Gare and Carl. And while yes, I do agree that these two characters are pure evil, they don't represent the bad side of the evil dichotomy here as much as the other character I'm going to mention. These two act more like forces of nature, similar to the monsters of ancient Greek myth. They're catalysts for the plot and the themes rather than the central figures in some primordial clash. They're more structurally relevant than they are thematically relevant, if that makes sense. The real character representing evil in this story though is William H. Macy as Jerry Lundegaard. I say this because Fargo's cosmology is a cosmology of Midwestern America. Because of that, if you want to understand its morality, you have to examine it the same way you would a fictional universe, so no different than Middle-earth or something like that. In the mundane Midwest, while killers and agents of true malice do exist, they're not really the norm. We don't associate, Midwestern America with those types of activities. By making that style of character the true opposite to the good, the message would then become that the Midwest is goodness itself. Well, I think the movie genuinely is a love letter to this underexamined section of American society. I don't think raising Midwesterners to the heights of sainthood was the goal here. I think instead the Midwestern cosmology is both good and evil, and for the sake of the story and its themes, there's a single representation of each here. Jerry's evil doesn't come from anything too lofty. His goal in life isn't to dominate or to destroy. All he wants is to move one notch up the social and economic ladder. As far as goals go, this one is kind of relatable to most of us regular people. What makes him different from us though, and a figure of evil in my opinion, is that his desperation for achievement drives him to immoral lengths. He doesn't just put strangers into life and death situations for these ends, but also the members of his own family. The logic I'm using here is that family is the backbone of this cosmology. It's what gives this world its structure, the same way that a mythical pillar or a benevolent ruling hierarchy would do in a more lofty movie. So if Jerry is evil, who is the opposite to evil in this story?
Hi, it's Marge.
Marge Gunderson's good, like Jerry's evil, is modest. She isn't the forgotten king of some divine order. She's not on the front lines of a battle for the state of the world. Her victory by the end of this story is pretty modest. It signals to us in the audience that her ways and lifestyle and her optimism will persist. What Fargo accomplishes, and it does this without being overly sentimental about it, is that it glorifies the goodness which exists in some people. This goodness is one which contributes to the world modestly. So modestly it almost feels futile or unimportant. But when you think about it, if every person in the world was at least as good as Marge was, or even if half of everybody was this consistently good, the world would obviously be a much better place. Because we all know this implicitly, this story about a very specific time and place now has universal implications. So what makes Marge different from Jerry then? Why did one end up one path with the other going about things differently? The answer here has to do with how these characters interpret the world around them. Some people would view this perspective as victim blaming, and while I do agree it has the potential to cross over into victim blaming when it's pushed to its most extreme, I also don't think it's too extreme to say that perspectives affect behavior, and in turn behavior leads to consequences for yourself and others. On top of that, the characters here in both cases are very privileged. They're both middle class, they both have people who love them in their life, they're both employed, and they live roughly in the same world. Marge finds happiness in this world. Not only does she have a loving husband, but a baby on the way, and a job that allows her to interact with people who she generally seems to like. When it comes to Jerry though, things are a little different. To him, his life feels more like a trap. He loves his wife well enough, it seems, but not enough to prioritize her safety. He loves his son, but not enough to empathize with how terrified he'd be at his mother being kidnapped. He, without even seeming to take pleasure in it, uses those around him like chess pieces. He prioritizes wealth. He conjures Gare and Carl into his world for the sake of wealth, the same way a villain might conjure evil spirits into a more fantastical good versus evil narrative. Marge, on the other hand, prioritizes safety and empathy. She assumes trust and good faith in others because it comes easy to herself. This attitude is so ingrained in her that when she finally does have evil trapped within her backseat, doing there like some elemental force, her questions to it might as well be, why do you even exist? Evil, of course, has no answer to this question. It exists for its own sake. It doesn't understand any other way. And on such a beautiful day is her rebuttal to how anyone could feed anyone else into a wood chipper. But rather than come across as naive or simple, this moment comes across as the first steps to Good's victory in the film. This victory doesn't come from Good's domination. It comes from Good's resilience. The clash between these two forces, good and evil, is eternal. This is one of the final scenes. The scene after it contrasts with it beautifully because of how it further spells out the themes we've been discussing discussing. Jerry, our villain, and not a very impressive one even from the beginning, ends up a sniveling rat squirming for escape in a motel room. It's as grand a defeat as Lucifer's in John Milton's Paradise Lost, yet everything about it is just so perfectly mundane. This focus on the mundane then reaches its ultimate moment afterward, with the final scene. The story ends at the end of the day, making it feel complete in a way that most of us who work a 9-to-5 can relate to. Marge readies herself for sleep next to her husband. After witnessing a dead body and a man scattered across the ice in little bits, her last act of the day is to ask her husband how his day went. When he informs her about his disappointment regarding the stamp contest, her only response is to look at the bright side, seeing his minor victory the same way he would view a major victory. The two scenes before this one lay the groundwork for the final emotional punch. This is the scene that drives it all home though. For evil to win, it has to dominate. For good to win, it simply has to persist. The ending of Fargo, despite the movie's general cynicism and black humor, is an optimistic one. At the end, they shut off the lights with eagerness for the future, the way a million others around the country and world do. This is why Marge Gunderson is the best hero in fiction in my opinion, because she's the hero who's closest to our daily experience.